Historians rediscovered this 1859 portrait, taken as inventory, now remembered as testimony. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as she pulled the cotton gloves tighter. The archive room in Charleston smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals, a scent she'd grown to love over 15 years of historical research. Before her, sealed in protective plastic, lay a daguerreotype she'd found referenced in a plantation ledger. Nothing more than a catalog number and a date, March 1859. The image showed 7 people arranged in 2 rows. Their faces were remarkably clear, captured by the expensive photographic technology of the time. But what struck Sarah immediately wasn't the technical quality, it was their eyes. Despite the formal, rigid poses required by long exposure times, something burned in those gazes. Defiance, dignity, something the photographer certainly hadn't intended to capture. This was taken at Thornhill Plantation, she murmured to her assistant, Marcus, who stood behind her. 6 months before John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, the owner commissioned it as property documentation for insurance purposes. Marcus leaned closer. Property documentation. God, that's dehumanizing, Sarah finished. That's exactly what it was. But look at this. She pointed to a young woman in the front row, perhaps 20 years old, wearing a simple cotton dress. See her left hand? It's positioned oddly, almost deliberately. The woman's fingers were spread against her thigh in what seemed like an uncomfortable pose. But as Sarah examined it more closely, she noticed the pattern, 3 fingers extended, 2 folded. It looked intentional, almost like a signal. Marcus breathed. Sarah pulled out her magnifying lens, her heart rate quickening. This was why she'd become a historian. Not for the dates and documents, but for moments like this, when the past suddenly spoke across centuries, when people who'd been reduced to inventory reclaimed their humanity through the smallest acts of resistance. She'd found similar hidden messages before in Civil War photographs, in quilts, in songs. The enslaved community had developed countless ways to communicate under the watching eyes of their oppressors. But she'd never seen it in a photograph explicitly created to catalog human beings as property. We need to find out who these people were, she said, already reaching for her phone to photograph the image. Every single one of them. They left us something here, Marcus. A message. And after 166 years, someone's finally looking closely enough to see it. Outside the archive, Charleston's spring rain began to fall. 3 days later, Sarah sat in her university office surrounded by documents. She'd barely slept, driven by a growing obsession with the 7 faces in that photograph. The Thornhill Plantation records were extensive. Wealthy families kept meticulous books, but finding the specific identities proved challenging. People were often listed only by first names, ages, and skills. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a Bible. The Thornhill family Bible, preserved at the South Carolina Historical Society, contained a handwritten insert, a single page, folded and hidden between psalms. It appeared to be written by Catherine Thornhill, the plantation owner's daughter, and dated October 1859, 7 months after the photograph. I can no longer remain silent. The entry began in elegant script. What I witnessed this spring haunts me still. Father commissioned Mr. Walters to photograph the house servants for his insurance documents, and I stood watching as he arranged them like furniture. But Hannah, dear, proud Hannah, who taught me to read when I was small, though she risked everything to do so, she looked directly at me as the photograph was made. In her eyes I saw not submission, but accusation. What have I become that I stand idle? Sarah's hands shook as she read. Hannah. She had a name now. The entry continued. Hannah's hand made a peculiar gesture during the exposure. I thought it strange at the time, but yesterday I understood. She was teaching me again, not from books this time, but from the silent language she and others use beneath Father's notice. 3 fingers for 3 days. She was telling me something was planned. 3 days after the photograph, Samuel disappeared. Then Joshua, then Maria. Father raged for weeks, never understanding they'd coordinated their escape right under his lens. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. The photograph wasn't just documentation. It was a planning session, hidden in plain sight, using the very technology meant to commodify them. These 7 people had communicated their intentions. She pulled up the daguerreotype image again, examining each person with new understanding. The young woman, Hannah, with her 3-fingered signal. Beside her, a man in his 40s whose slight nod Sarah had dismissed as a blur from movement. Now she recognized it as acknowledgement. Behind them, others with minute variations in posture that suddenly seemed deliberate. They were coordinating, she whispered. Right there. While being photographed as inventory, they were planning freedom. Marcus entered with coffee and more documents. I found the plantation's expense ledgers from 1859. You're going to want to see this. The ledgers told a story of chaos. In April 1859, Thornhill Plantation reported 3 people as absconded. By June, 4 more. The entries grew increasingly frustrated, the handwriting deteriorating from precise copperplate to angry scratches. 7, Sarah said, comparing the photograph to the ledger entries. All 7 people in this photograph escaped within 3 months. That's not coincidence. Marcus had been researching escape routes. The Underground Railroad had multiple lines running through South Carolina, but they were incredibly dangerous. The Fugitive Slave Act meant bounty hunters operated everywhere. For 7 people to successfully escape in coordinated waves, that required serious planning and support. Sarah examined the photograph again, this time focusing on the background. The image had been taken outside, against the plantation's main house. She could see a portion of the garden, a window, and... Wait! She grabbed her magnifying glass. Look at the window. 2nd floor, partially visible. In the reflection, barely discernible, was a figure. Someone had been watching from inside the house when the photograph was taken. The exposure time required for daguerreotypes meant this person had stood still for at least 30 seconds, deliberately observing. Catherine Thornhill, Sarah murmured, remembering the Bible entry. She was watching, and she understood. Over the next week, Sarah dove deeper into Catherine's history. Born 1837, she would have been 22 when the photograph was taken. Unlike many plantation daughters, she'd kept extensive diaries, most focused on social events and suitable topics for young women. But between the lines, Sarah found hints of a secret life, entries about walking in the evening gardens, notes about delivering preserves to the quarters. Innocent activities on the surface, but the frequency and timing suggested something more. Cross-referencing with the escape dates, Sarah discovered Catherine had mentioned these garden walks within days of each disappearance. She was helping them, Marcus said, reading over Sarah's shoulder. The plantation owner's daughter was helping her father's slaves escape, but the evidence remained circumstantial. Sarah needed something more concrete. She returned to the photograph, examining every detail. The 7 people arranged in 2 rows, Hannah's hand signal. The poses that seemed awkward until you understood they were passing messages. Then she noticed something she'd missed before. At the bottom edge of the photograph, partially obscured, lay a basket, the kind used for carrying laundry or produce. But inside, just barely visible, was what looked like folded fabric. Sarah enhanced the digital image, increasing the contrast. The fabric showed a pattern, geometric shapes in varying shades. That's not random, she breathed. That's a quilt pattern. Quilt patterns as coded messages had been debated by historians for decades. Some dismissed it as myth. Others believed enslaved people had used specific patterns to communicate escape routes and safe houses. Sarah had always remained cautiously skeptical, until now. She contacted Dr. James Wilson, an expert in material culture at Howard University. Within hours, he'd identified the pattern visible in the photograph's basket. That's a bear's paw variation, James explained via video call, his excitement palpable. Also called a bear track. In documented Underground Railroad communication systems, it indicated the need to follow a literal trail through the woods, moving like bears, covering tracks, traveling at night, following waterways. Could this be authentic? Sarah asked. I've seen so many quilts attributed to escape codes without solid proof. The context matters, James replied. A quilt pattern visible in an 1859 photograph at a plantation where 7 people successfully escaped in coordinated attempts, with evidence of insider assistance. That's not folklore, that's documentation. Sarah spent the next 2 weeks tracking down every piece of evidence she could find about the Thornhill escapes. Newspaper advertisements for runaways described the 7 people in detail, offering substantial rewards. Letters between plantation owners discussed the epidemic of disappearances in the Charleston area during 1859. But the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source: Canada. The Buxton settlement in Ontario had been established as a refuge for formerly enslaved people who'd escaped via the Underground Railroad. Their meticulous records included arrival dates, departure points, and sometimes the routes taken. Sarah submitted a research request, hardly daring to hope. The response arrived on a Tuesday morning. Her hands shook as she opened the email attachment. 3 names matched. Hannah Freeman, age 23, arrived July 1859 from South Carolina. Samuel Brooks, age 44, arrived August 1859 from Charleston area. Maria Taylor, age 19, arrived September 1859, accompanied by 4 others whose names were listed collectively as the Thornhill Group. All 7 had made it. Every single person in that photograph had successfully escaped to freedom. Sarah sat at her desk, tears streaming down her face. These weren't just names in a ledger anymore. They were people who'd risked everything, who'd communicated under impossible conditions, who'd coordinated one of the most successful mass escapes in South Carolina history, and they'd done it while being photographed as property. "Marcus," she called, her voice thick with emotion. "We need to find their descendants. These people, they deserve to know their ancestors' story. They deserve to see this photograph and understand what it really shows." Marcus nodded, already pulling up genealogical databases. "Where do we start?" "With Hannah," Sarah said, looking at the young woman's defiant eyes in the photograph. "We start with Hannah Freeman." The genealogical research proved more challenging than Sarah anticipated. Records for formerly enslaved people were often incomplete or non-existent. Names changed frequently after emancipation, and family lines were disrupted by sales, escapes, and the chaos of the Civil War. But Sarah had one advantage: the detailed Buxton settlement records. Hannah Freeman had married in 1862, becoming Hannah Williams. She'd had 6 children, all born free in Canada. The last known record placed her in Detroit in 1889, age 53, living with her daughter's family. From there, Sarah worked forward through census records, death certificates, and city directories. The trail went cold several times, requiring creative detective work and help from genealogists specializing in African American family history. But gradually, a family tree emerged. After 3 weeks of intensive research, Sarah found her. Jennifer Williams Porter, age 47, a high school history teacher in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Hannah Freeman's great-great-great-granddaughter. Sarah's email was carefully composed. She introduced herself, explained the discovery, and attached a low-resolution image of the photograph. "Your ancestor Hannah was a remarkable woman," she wrote. "I believe she left us a message that's been waiting 166 years to be understood. If you're interested, I'd like to share her story with you." The response came within 2 hours. "I'm shaking," Jennifer wrote. "My grandmother told me stories about Hannah, passed down through generations. She said Hannah escaped from slavery and helped others escape too, but we had no proof, no documentation. Just family stories. When can we talk?" They scheduled a video call for that evening. When Jennifer's face appeared on screen, Sarah caught her breath. The resemblance to the photograph was striking. The same high cheekbones, the same determined set of the jaw, the same eyes that seemed to look straight through the camera. "I've waited my whole life to see a photograph of her," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "Family legend said she was photographed once, before the escape, but we never knew what happened to it. Show me, please." Sarah shared her screen, displaying the full daguerreotype. Jennifer was silent for a long moment, her hand covering her mouth. "That's her," she whispered. "That's really her. And you're telling me, while this photograph was being taken, she was planning her escape?" "Not just planning," Sarah said gently. "Coordinating. Look at her left hand." She explained the signal, the hidden messages, the quilt pattern in the basket, the evidence of Catherine Thornhill's assistance. With each revelation, Jennifer's eyes widened. "She outsmarted them," Jennifer said, wonder in her voice. "While they were documenting her as property, she was documenting her resistance. She left proof. She left testimony," Sarah corrected. "That's exactly what this is, testimony. 7 people testifying to their humanity, their intelligence, their courage, captured in the very photograph meant to dehumanize them." Jennifer arrived in Charleston 3 days later. She stood in the archive room, wearing white cotton gloves, holding the actual daguerreotype case for the first time. The archive had granted special permission for this viewing, understanding the profound personal and historical significance. "Can I tell you what my grandmother told me?" Jennifer asked quietly, her eyes never leaving Hannah's face in the photograph. "She said Hannah was a teacher. Not formally. She'd have been killed for that. But she taught people to read in secret, used Bible verses so if they were caught, they could claim religious study. My grandmother said Hannah believed education was the first step to freedom." Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. "That matches Catherine Thornhill's Bible entry. She wrote that Hannah taught her to read when she was small. I thought maybe she meant helped, but if Hannah was secretly teaching, it would make sense. Jennifer finished. Catherine learned from Hannah as a child, probably not even realizing at the time that what they were doing was forbidden, dangerous. By the time Catherine understood, she was complicit, connected. Marcus, who'd been quietly researching in the corner, looked up. I found something else about Catherine. After the war, she never married. She used her inheritance to fund a school, a freedmen's school in Charleston. It operated from 1867 to 1873, providing education to formerly enslaved people. The three of them looked at each other, the implications settling over them. Hannah changed her, Jennifer said softly. A little black girl, enslaved, taught a white plantation daughter to read, and in doing so, taught her something more fundamental, taught her to see. Sarah pulled out the Catherine Thornhill documents she'd compiled. I think Catherine helped all 7 people escape. The timing, the access, her notes about walking in the gardens. She had the freedom of movement they didn't. She could carry messages, hide supplies, coordinate with Underground Railroad contacts. Did she get caught? Jennifer asked. No record of it, Marcus replied. But her father's letters from 1860 show increasing paranoia. He moved most of his remaining slaves to a plantation in Georgia, suspecting abolitionist influence in Charleston. Catherine stayed behind, claiming poor health. 6 months later, the Civil War started. Jennifer was still studying her ancestor's face. I want people to know this story. Not just historians, everyone. I want people to see this photograph and understand what it really is. A museum exhibit, Sarah said immediately. Not just the photograph, but the full story. The escape, the coordination, the courage, Catherine's role, the successful arrival in Canada, your family history. We make this photograph what Hannah intended, a testimony that can't be silenced. When? Jennifer asked. The 166th anniversary is in 2 months, Marcus noted. March 2025. Exactly 166 years since the photograph was taken. Jennifer nodded slowly. Then we have work to do. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Sarah contacted museum curators across the country, presenting the story with the passion of someone who'd lived with these 7 faces for months. The response was overwhelming. 3 major museums wanted the exhibit. Eventually, they chose the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The photograph would return to public view in the nation's capital. Meanwhile, Jennifer worked on tracing the other 6 people in the photograph. Using Sarah's research as a starting point, she connected with genealogists, historians, and amateur family researchers across the United States and Canada. Social media proved invaluable. A single post about Samuel Brooks led to contact with his great-great-grandson in Toronto within 24 hours. By early March, they'd found descendants of 5 of the 7 people. Each had family stories, passed down memories, treasured keepsakes. Maria Taylor's great-great-great-granddaughter in Detroit had a quilt, not the one from the photograph, but one Maria had made in Canada, featuring the bear's paw pattern prominently in the center. She never forgot, the granddaughter Patricia said during their video call. This quilt was her testimony too. She passed it to her daughter with instructions to preserve it, to remember what it meant, to remember the price of freedom. The 2 remaining people, Joshua and Ruth, identified from plantation records, remained elusive. Despite extensive searches, no confirmed descendants came forward. It was Sarah's research assistant, a graduate student named Lisa Chen, who suggested an alternative approach. What if we focus on where they might have gone instead of who they became? Lisa proposed. The Buxton records showed they arrived together. Maybe they stayed together. She was right. Church records in Buxton revealed Joshua Henderson and Ruth Carter had married in 1860. Their descendants had remained in Ontario, and while the family name had changed through marriages, the line was traceable. Within a week, Jennifer was speaking with Thomas Jefferson Henderson, a retired schoolteacher in Toronto who'd grown up hearing stories about ancestors who'd escaped from somewhere in the South. I never knew the details, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion as Jennifer shared the photograph, just that they'd been brave, that they'd risked everything. Seeing their faces now, knowing they succeeded, it's overwhelming. The museum exhibit came together with remarkable speed. The centerpiece was the daguerreotype itself, displayed with modern technology that allowed visitors to examine every detail. Touchscreens enabled people to zoom in, to see Hannah's hand signal, the quilt pattern, Catherine's reflection in the window. But surrounding the photograph was something more powerful. The Descendants. 7 families, 7 stories of survival and success, all stemming from that single act of coordinated resistance in March 1859. Jennifer worked with a documentary filmmaker to record oral histories. Each descendant shared what had been passed down through generations, the scraps of memory that had survived 166 years. The night before the exhibit opening, Sarah sat alone with the photograph one final time. The conservation team had done remarkable work stabilizing the daguerreotype, ensuring it would survive for future generations. But what struck her most wasn't the technical preservation. It was knowing that tomorrow, Hannah's testimony would finally be heard. Her phone buzzed. Jennifer had sent a message. "Can't sleep. Keep thinking about what Hannah would want us to know." Sarah called her. "I've been thinking about that too." What message did she leave beyond the escape itself? That they were human, Jennifer said immediately. That's the core of it, isn't it? In that moment, being photographed as property, reduced to inventory, Hannah and the others asserted their humanity through intelligence, coordination, courage. They refused to be only what that camera was meant to capture. The photographer saw property, Sarah agreed. But Hannah made sure we'd eventually see people. Whole, complex, strategic people who outwitted a system designed to destroy them. There was a pause. Then Jennifer spoke again, her voice quieter. "My daughter asked me something yesterday. She's 15, studying the Civil War in school. She asked if Hannah was angry. What did you tell her?" That anger would have been justified, but what I see in that photograph isn't anger. It's determination, strategy, love for the 6 people standing with her, and for the ones she'd help escape after. Hannah wasn't consumed by what had been done to her. She was focused on what she was going to do next. Sarah felt tears building. That's the testimony, isn't it? Not just survival, but active resistance. Not just escaping themselves, but creating a network, helping others, using even the tools of oppression as weapons of liberation. The photograph was meant to diminish them, Jennifer said. Instead, it immortalized their genius. The next morning, the museum filled with people. Historians, students, descendants of Underground Railroad conductors, and hundreds of others drawn by the story. News coverage had been extensive. Hidden message in 1859. Photograph revealed after 166 years was trending nationally. But the most powerful moment came when the 7 families stood together in front of the photograph for the first time. Jennifer and Thomas, Patricia with Maria's quilt, Samuel's great-great-grandson and his children, the others whose ancestors had stood in that same formation 166 years ago. A museum photographer asked them to pose for a commemorative photo. Without discussion, they arranged themselves in 2 rows, mirroring the original daguerreotype. But this time, they stood as free people, honoring ancestors who'd refused to be anything less than human. Jennifer raised her left hand, fingers positioned exactly as Hannah's had been. 3 extended, 2 folded. One by one, the others did the same. The message, finally, was received. In the weeks following the exhibit opening, something unexpected happened. The photograph went viral online, shared millions of times across social media platforms. But unlike most viral content, it sparked sustained, serious conversation about historical memory, the archives we keep, and the stories we tell. Museums across the country began re-examining their collections, looking at old photographs with new eyes. How many other images, cataloged as simple documentation, contained hidden messages? How many other testimonies had been waiting, unread, for someone to look closely enough? Sarah found herself inundated with requests. Archivists sent her photographs to examine. Genealogists shared family stories that might connect to Underground Railroad activities. The project that had begun with one daguerreotype expanded into a comprehensive research initiative, but she tried to keep her focus on the original 7. Each deserved their full story told. With Jennifer's help, she published a detailed academic paper documenting the escape, the coordination methods, and Catherine Thornhill's role. The paper challenged previous assumptions about enslaved people's resistance strategies, providing concrete evidence of sophisticated planning and cross-racial cooperation. Catherine's story proved particularly resonant. Her Bible entry and subsequent actions complicated simplistic narratives about complicity and resistance in the antebellum South. She'd been raised in a system of oppression, benefited from it materially, yet ultimately chose to undermine it at considerable personal risk. "She's not a hero," Jennifer said during one of their many conversations. "That word belongs to Hannah and the others who had no choice, who suffered directly. But Catherine made a choice when she could have looked away. That matters too. The historical community debated this fiercely. Some argued that highlighting Catherine's role diminished the enslaved people's agency. Others contended that understanding the network of support was essential to comprehending how escape succeeded against impossible odds. Sarah tried to honor both perspectives. In her writing and presentations, she centered Hannah's intelligence and leadership while acknowledging the reality that successful escapes required both internal resistance and external support. The photograph itself demonstrated this, 7 people coordinating their own liberation, while Catherine observed from the window, learning to see. Thomas Henderson brought his granddaughter to Charleston for a private viewing. The girl, 12 years old, stood transfixed before the daguerreotype. "That's my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather?" she asked, pointing to Joshua's figure. "Yes," Thomas said softly. "He was about your age when he came to that plantation. He grew up enslaved, but he never accepted it. And when the opportunity came, he was ready." The girl studied the photograph intently. "What happened after they escaped?" Thomas pulled out the family research Jennifer had helped compile. "He married Ruth, the woman standing next to him. They had 7 children in Canada, all born free. He worked as a carpenter, built houses. One of those houses still stands in Buxton. Your father and I visited it last year. Can we go?" the girl asked. "This summer," Thomas promised. "We'll trace the whole journey, from Charleston to Buxton, following their path." On the 1-year anniversary of the exhibit opening, the museum hosted a symposium. Scholars presented papers on resistance photography, Underground Railroad networks, and material culture as historical evidence. But the final panel was reserved for the descendants. Jennifer spoke first, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "When Dr. Mitchell first contacted me, I thought I'd be learning about my ancestor. And I did. I learned about Hannah's courage, her intelligence, her refusal to be defined by her circumstances. But I learned something else too. I learned that testimony doesn't end. That photograph has been testifying for 166 years, and it's still speaking. Every time someone looks at it and sees not property but people, Hannah's testimony continues." Patricia shared Maria's quilt with the audience, explaining the patterns and their meanings. "My ancestor made this in freedom, but she never forgot where she came from. Every stitch is a memory, every pattern a message. She wanted us to remember, not just the suffering, but the resistance. Not just what was done to her, but what she did." Thomas spoke about Joshua and Ruth's life in Canada, the community they built, the freedom they claimed. They could have disappeared into anonymity, changed their names, buried their past, but they didn't. They told their children where they came from and what they'd survived. They made sure the story continued. When the descendants finished speaking, Sarah took the stage for closing remarks. She projected the photograph onto a large screen behind her, Hannah's face visible to everyone in the auditorium. "This image was created to document property," she began. "But Hannah and the 6 people with her transformed it into something else. Evidence of resistance, proof of humanity, testimony of courage. They couldn't speak openly. They couldn't write their story in words that would survive. But they could use their bodies, their positioning, their subtle signals to leave a message for anyone who would eventually look closely enough to see it." She paused, looking at the faces in the audience. Scholars, students, descendants, community members. That's our responsibility now. To look closely, to read the testimonies left by people who couldn't speak freely, to understand that archives aren't neutral. They reflect power structures, preserve certain voices while silencing others. But if we look carefully, if we read critically, we can sometimes hear the silenced voices speaking through the cracks. Hannah left us this photograph as testimony. But every descendant here is also testimony, living proof that resistance succeeded, that freedom was claimed, that love and hope and strategic brilliance could overcome even the most dehumanizing systems. The photograph shows 7 people. But standing in this room are hundreds of descendants, and scattered across North America are thousands more, all living the freedom Hannah and the others fought for. Sarah looked up at the image behind her, at Hannah's eyes staring across 166 years with undiminished intensity. "This is what testimony looks like," she said quietly. "Not just words, not just documents, but presence. Hannah is present in her great-great-great-granddaughter who teaches history to young people, ensuring the next generation knows these stories. She's present in every descendant who carries forward the courage and determination she embodied. She's present every time someone looks at this photograph and sees not inventory but testimony. The photograph was taken in March 1859. By July, Hannah was free. By September, all 7 were free. They didn't just survive, they prevailed. And their testimony continues. As long as we keep looking, keep listening, keep honoring their refusal to be reduced to anything less than fully human. The auditorium was silent for a moment. Then Jennifer stood, and one by one, every descendant in the room rose with her. They raised their left hands, 3 fingers extended, 2 folded. Hannah's signal, no longer hidden, now proclaimed openly in a room full of witnesses. The testimony, 166 years in the making, had been received, and it would not be forgotten again.